Ratchet is a clothing company from the UK started by a young man with a vision, a dream, and determination. They have various prints and styles for men, women, and children. I'll include a link to their website down below in the description for this video. So this is a first for Sit Down News. We have Scott Deitche, best-selling author. I have my notes, Scott, for you. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. And I just want to say that some of your books include Cigar City Mafia, The Silent Dawn, Garden State Gangland, and your latest Hitman, which we'll be talking about today. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, John. Appreciate it.
I read a digital copy of your book, and not only is it written well, you thoroughly researched the book. So congratulations on the
Thank
book.
you.
You should be
Appreciate
proud of it. Before we start, I want to just ask you something. You either were or are still the editor of Cigar City magazine. Is that
Actually, I wrote for Cigar City magazine. I wasn't the
several
editor.
articles, right?
Yeah, I wrote some articles for there, and actually the editor is now my partner. We run the Tampa Mafia tours in Tampa.
That's the next thing I was going to talk
Yeah.
about. Are you still doing it? I know when we spoke a long time ago, that was like put off because of everything that was going on.
Yeah, once COVID started kind of kicking back a little bit, things took off, and we had a really banner year this year. And we actually just had our last tour. We don't do our tours in the summer because walking around Tampa in the middle of summer is not a not a fun experience for a walking tour. So we go from September to May.
And quickly, I know that you donated some items to the Mafia Museum in Vegas. Can you just tell us what they were? I remember you telling me one time.
Yeah, so I've been involved with I'm on the advisory council of the Mod Museum in Vegas, and I've been involved with them since before they opened in 2012. And I had all these like charts that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement put together with the Trafficante family and a lot of original mugshots of Tampa wise guys. And, I can't keep that stuff really the way it needs to be kept, especially the paper type things, like these wall charts on foam board and stuff they're already starting to kind of decay a little bit. So I donated them all to the museum, a good selection of material, and figuring even if because they rotate displays in and out, and some of my stuff has been on display, and even if it's not, it's being kept where this could be preserved. So yeah, it's a lot of original mugshots of some Tampa wise guys, and those great wall charts you see that they always show at the press conferences.
Yeah.
So a few of those as well.
Also, on another topic, I know that your drink is the Negroni.
Correct. Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, that's gin, vermouth, and Campari, right?
Correct. Yeah.
If it's made right.
It's made right. Yeah.
I read that you got help from the DEA, the DOJ, and the criminal division at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, really, a lot of it hinged on this single DEA report that I managed to get a pretty unredacted copy of. It was published in 1976 that talked about the activities of what was called at that time, and it's kind of become known as the Purple Gang. Now, when people think about the Purple Gang in mob terms, they think about the Jewish gangsters, back in the 1920s. But there was this, my book is about the Purple Gang of East Harlem in the 70s. And yeah, this is like the holy grail to find this DEA report. And I found a guy, and this was during COVID, so it was really hard to get anything, anyone to go look for anything. And they sent me a copy of this report.
I believe that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the original Purple Gang were all made up of Jewish guys, right?
Correct, yeah. And then this gang of predominantly Italian, the wise guys or wise guy associates at that time in the 70s kind of co-opted that name. Although, there's a good part of my book, and you read it, nobody really knows where the name came from. Eventually it just emerges.
Yeah, there's different stories of where they got the name from.
Yeah, absolutely.
TV show, right?
Yeah. So one guy I talked to, he was involved in the drug rackets back then. And he said, yeah, I heard they got it from the movie, The Purple Gang, that was shown on local TV. And then the cops said that the newspapers made it up. The newspaper said the cops made it up, and nobody really knows where it started, but it kind of becomes part of the vernacular.
So one of the things that I took notice was that you had demonstrated extensive knowledge of Harlem. So I just want to get actually this question. Did you go visit, or was it just through research?
No, I had actually gone to visit a couple times.
I figured you did.
Yeah, I walked up and down the streets, and a few times on my trips to New York. One of the things I like to do as an author is really go to a place, and even if it doesn't reflect it in the book, I think it's important to get to know a place. And you obviously can't spend a ton of time there, but at least get to walk the streets and see what it's like, on that street level. Look at, one of the things I always do is I make a list of the old hangouts and what they look like now, just to get a feel of what it was like back then.
I didn't want to assume it, but when I was reading, I says, I'll bet dollars to donuts he went there, because just to get the feel to write. I figured that. What I found interesting, and I didn't know, was this 22 caliber killings.
Yeah.
That's like a very important part of this book and the Purple Gang in itself. So for the people who haven't read it, I mean, you could explain what that's about.
Yeah, so like there was a time there in like 1977 to 1978, there were a bunch of newspaper articles that talked about this spate of 22 caliber killings that were taking place. And they were lumping in all these mob hits from around the country. A lot of them were of people that were suspected of being informants, and they were all killed with a 22 caliber. And it kind of took on a life of its own. It became kind of this mythology. And you see, like if you go on newspapers.com and you search it, you see this huge spike in articles over 2 years, and it dies out and they find something else to write about.
Yeah.
But there were really this spate of 22 caliber killings, and a lot of them probably weren't related. Like Sam Giancana's killing is thrown in there, which is really nothing to do with some of the other ones. But there was a group of them that took place primarily in the New York area that were of predominantly Genovese associated guys, and some of the ballistics tied them all together to guns that were purchased in Florida in the mid 70s by members of the Purple Gang. So there's this thread of the Purple Gang that gets woven into these 22 caliber killings.
And I believe that one of the murders was James Queally. Am I saying his name? Queally?
Yeah. He was the principal in Newark. He was killed. He was shot and killed. And his gun was the same gun used to murder 3 other guys.
I think 4 or 5 murders, right?
Yeah.
And what surprises me is that I'm very, very surprised that they kept a gun that was what would be called in the street, like it's a dirty gun. Like, why? I don't know why they would keep this gun that had murders on it.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't know if they were unaware of. And the interesting thing is, even the ballistics, it took a few years to really start matching some of the ballistics. So maybe they thought the law enforcement wasn't savvy enough to link those all. But
back then, getting a weapon was very easy. They had weapons at their disposal. So would you have a favorite gun that you did hits with? It was just.
Oh, yeah. During the Purple Gang era, and when these guys were coming up in East Harlem, there was a lot of back and forth killings of each other, whether there were guys in the gang or guys associated with the gang. And it was almost like things got to a point where they almost ate each other from within the gang, because they became so violent, not only with outsiders, but internally as well.
They were very, very treacherous and very well known, throughout New York. And one of the guys that you mentioned, and law enforcement has him grouped with his brother, and then they even go on to say that he was an actual member, was Thomas D'Ambrosio. And I was away with Thomas. I was friends with Thomas. And as you know, Thomas is a member of the Lucchese family as well. And he spoke about which he called them the Purples, right? That was a Harlem thing. They called them the Purples. But by the way, he loved Michael Melnish. He loved Michael and Joey, but he loved Michael Melnish. And he was telling me stories about when what he called the Nappers were kidnapping the junk pushers in the neighborhood, and basically said that the Purples protected the neighborhood junk pushers from the Napas, which you wrote about a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And, there's this really complex relationship. So D'Ambrosia, figures in as being a supplier of a lot of these guys. The kidnapping for hire becomes a big moneymaker. I don't think a lot of people, even people that are more into mob stuff than the casual listener or person who follows this, realizes the kidnapping for hire or for ransom was big money for organized crime in the 70s. There are big guys like Ettore Zappi was kidnapped and held for ransom. So this was big money for a lot of those guys. Yeah, so the Purple Gang were, they're really neighborhood oriented and primarily based out of East Harlem, and then most of them later moved to like the Bronx and Yonkers and places like that.
And there were a lot of them were related to
Yes.
people that were tied to organized crime.
But the interesting thing is, around the early 80s, the Purple Gang starts splintering off because some of these guys become made members of families. So they start, naturally gravitating more towards their families where they land up. So I found this really interesting paper by this University of New Mexico criminologist who did in the early 80s, and who did a network analysis of the Purple Gang, which is kind of a scientific way of looking at how you could tell if a group of individuals are connected. And he did a really good job at showing some of the familial connections with a lot of the Purple Gang members, whether it was the Priscos and the Meldishes or the Delavals or the Cayanos. And, you see these, uncles and nephews and brothers and all connected, interwoven.
There's some interesting names that I wrote down. So you have Daniel Leo, which is the former acting boss of the West Side, which is the Genovese family.
Yeah.
Matty Madonna, my former acting boss with the Lucchese's. You have Michael Mancuso, is the current, according to what we're hearing, Bonanno boss. Angelo Prisco, which was a captain with the West Side, Genovese family. I have a funny story that Thomas D'Ambrosio told me about him. He purchased blue contacts and put them in. And they were running around teasing him, calling them blue eyes. And he took them out. He didn't like that. He took them out. These guys grew up together. They played stickball as kids in the street, most of these guys. And then you have one guy, Frankie Salerno, I think with his brother. Frankie Salerno's with a member of the Lucchese family. I would speak to him a lot about Thomas because Thomas moved to Florida.
Okay.
Kind of, if there is such a thing, is in semi-retirement, and he's, not in the best of health. But there's a lot. So a lot of these guys that originated out of the Purple Gang some are bosses and some have positions and are actual members of Cosa Nostra in New York.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the Purple Gang became like a farm league to some of the big families, like you said, whether it was Leo or Prisco and Matthew Madonna was really interesting because he was only on the street and I didn't realize this till I started really researching. He was in prison for most of his career. He went away
like
for
30-something years.
Yeah. So, he was, he started off with the Purple Gang. He becomes this big supplier to Nicky Barnes. And then he goes away. And then, so he was made when he got out, but when was he made acting boss?
I don't remember what year, obviously it was well before my time, but he got out. They strained him out, they inducted him. They made him, when they do what I'm going to say, they're setting you up for the position. They bumped him up to a captain position. He had to be a captain with no men because he was on paper, he was on parole.
Yeah.
And then he went into the acting boss position.
Okay.
So very quickly he kind of moved up. During your research in the book, was there anything that shocked you that you found out?
So there were a few things when I was reading this, when I was doing the research for this, that kind of surprised me. One was the interconnectedness with all of the Purple Gang members. I didn't realize how interconnected. And, I started seeing these threads of guys. I'm like, oh, he's here, he's here, he's here. It really kind of showed you how insular that East Harlem drug scene and, that whole scene was. The other thing was where they all ended up living, and there's, so it kind of follows that pattern. They grow up in East Harlem, then they move out to the suburbs.
Yeah.
But they all move to the same suburbs, like Tuckahoe or Yonkers or, Rockland County. They all live by each other when they kind of go up. And you see that now. There was just the bust, some of the more recent busts, you see guys that are in those same suburbs. So it's
Yeah.
funny how it kind of follows this pattern demographically, how they move out of New York City.
There's not much known until you book, the research that you've done about the Purple Gang. It's, you've mostly heard from word of mouth about
So one of the things I first wanted to do was the Purple Gang even a thing? Because it's become kind of this mythology of the Purple Gang. Was it even really a group? And I think through my research, and especially through Professor Lupsha at University of New Mexico's research, okay, yeah, there was a group of guys that definitely were connected. And then the second thing was, well, were they really called the Purple Gang? Well, yeah, I think no matter who started it by the late 70s, and you, I think, can attest to this because we've talked before about this, people refer to those guys as, yeah, they were part of the Purple Gang.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I kind of likened it to the Westies. And when I talked to TJ English, he said, yeah, the Westies really were coined by Joe Coffey, the cop, but then the guys started calling each other the Westies, so it
Yeah.
became a thing. So probably a very similar thing happened with the Purple Gang. Now most of the guys like yourself or other people that grew up in the life, oh yeah, that guy was part of the Purple Gang back in the day.
And I could tell you that in that life, when we would hear, oh, so and so, oh yeah, he was with the Purples, you knew he was a serious guy. They were serious.
But just the inner, the intra-gang killings and the violence was a little bit shocking to me, that they just turned on each other so regular, easily. But yet the guys that managed to emerge from the gang after like the mid 70s, kind of the violence internally starts to fade away a little bit. Then you see it becoming more aligned with the Genovese and the Bonanos probably, and Lucchese's. You don't see many go with the Gambinos or any with the Colombos really, maybe
Yeah.
one or two. Then they start, as they get older and they start becoming made guys in the family, they start kind of reducing that level. But they were really, like you said, very capable hitters back in the day. And that's one of the other things too, is you'll see guys like Joey Meldish. Oh, he was responsible for 100 murders. Well, I never found 100 murders he was responsible for. So some of that gets kind of, blown up over the years, but they definitely were involved in a lot of killings and violence.
Yeah, I mean, you could believe that there was a lot of people killed.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that you mentioned, you asked me before, what kind of surprised me. The other thing, and I again don't think a lot of people realize, especially even people that follow mafia stuff closely, how many guys were whacked in the 70s? That was a very violent decade for organized crime. Very violent.
And that's really when they were at their strongest. Made guys themselves were scared when it came to the Purple Gang. They had a lot of people nervous.
Yeah. And, you really see in the late 70s, especially with the Purple Gang, is they start gravitating, again, a good chunk of them towards the Genovese guys. John DiGilio out in New Jersey, he buys some of their guns. You see some of the people that are killed associated with him tied back to the Purple Gang. And then they start, expanding. There's the murder of boat owner Don Arano in 1987 in Miami, Aventura area of Florida. He was best friends with Frank Vicerdo, who was a member of the Purple Gang. Don Arano he founded Donzi, cigarette boats. He owned a bunch of manufacturing plants, and what they used to call Thunderboat Row or Thunderboat Alley in Aventura. Now, except for one, the entire road is all condos, like like most of South Florida. Yeah, but he was making boats for drug runners, and he was making boats for U.S. Customs.
That's when the problem started. U.S. Customs was able to catch up to these drug runners, before they weren't. Their boats were too fast for them.
I always wanted to write a book about the kind of the gritty 70s era New York. And, I'm 50, so I was a kid growing up during that time right outside the city. But, we go into the city and I still got some of that flavor. But I didn't expect to be drawn into Miami Vice era Florida out of this. So that was an interesting turn.
Yeah.
But it makes sense, because at that time, a lot of wise guys were operating in Florida. In fact, I talked to the old Broward sheriff who told me, he said, yeah, there were hundreds upon hundreds of guys who would just flock down to Fort Lauderdale, Miami back in the 80s. And because we were so focused on the Colombians and the Cubans and the cocaine cowboy era, they would just kind of fly in a little bit under the radar. And, you know, when Gotti came in, they would follow Gotti, but, you know, for every John Gotti, there were 4 or 5 guys, you know, that they didn't know that much about that were operating down there. So it's
Yeah,
kind
well,
of
a
like,
lot of guys go down to Florida.
yeah, yeah. So
That's their vacation spot.
yeah,
And business,
absolutely.
you know.
Yeah.
As far as the writing goes, right? You get writer's block, and what do you do to get out of it?
I do sometimes, you know, one of my limitations with this book is when I signed the contract with the publisher was like in early 2020. So bulk of my book was done during COVID, which is good for the actual writing, but it was difficult to, when I wanted to reach out to people, I couldn't go to places that I wanted to go.
Right.
But instead, I kind of dug a little bit deeper. And in fact, I think I had over 400 sources for this book, which is the most I've ever had for any of my books. So yeah, sometimes you get a little block, and yeah, I tend to procrastinate on my books. I'm not going to lie. I always say I'm not going to, but I do procrastinate. But I sometimes when I have writer's block, I remember that I have a deadline for the publisher, and it kind of makes me force
Yeah.
through it. But every writer has that. It's natural part of writing. You're going to get to a point where you're like, I don't even want to touch this for like 2 weeks. But so when it comes back to you, you just have to work that much faster, or, you know, have it flow through you a little bit easier.
So when Michael Milnish was killed, that sent shockwaves throughout the street. You know, a lot of people were very surprised.
Yeah, and that was actually what gave me the idea for the book, was actually after the Meldish killing, because I'd heard Purple Gang before and never really gave it much thought.
Yep.
Then I'm like, oh, this is kind of an interesting killing. This is a guy who hasn't been on anybody's radar for years, gets killed in the Bronx, you know, I think it was the Poster or the Daily News, wherever it was, you know, the article, former leader of the Purple Gang killed.
Yep.
So I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. So that, you know, I was at that time when he was killed, I was 2 books away from this one. So I already had 2 books kind of I wanted to write, but I always thought, yeah, I think the Purple Gang would be an interesting topic,
It is. Yeah.
because I had never really heard about it. And at that point, I'd been following mafia stuff, you know, 15 years. And then I'm like, oh, this is new and interesting.
I remember when you first mentioned it, I was excited. Couldn't wait for you to finish. I was excited.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. There's a lot of great stories out there to be told, you know,
Yeah.
with this life. And, you know, I know John Gleason just released another Gotti book. I don't need to do that. I don't need another Capone book. There's so many other guys out there, so many other great stories out there that I
Yeah.
think people would be really interested in hearing.
Yeah. And I think that, and not just because you're the author, I think that this is one of them. I got to be honest with you.
Oh, thank you.
This is something that, you know, like you mentioned, you could go and buy an Al Capone book. You could go buy 20 John Gotti books. But how many books on the Purple Gang? You know, the Harlem Purple Gang?
Yeah, none.
Well, none, except you.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be a success. I read it. I read it. I got to tell you, I read it in one day.
Thank you. I appreciate
In
it.
one day. So
Yeah,
that's how I know it's good, when I read a book. I finished it in one day, and it was very, very well researched. You did your due diligence.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So Scott, one of the things that always comes up time and time again is that there is a myth that the mob was not involved in drugs because it was a rule. I know that to be not true. I know that every family had their drug people in place. What did you find out about the Purple Gang and the mob from back then?
Yeah. Oh, obviously, as you said, that's really a myth, because the mafia were always heavily involved in the drug trade, dating back all the way back to the 1920s, even before then, really. But germane to the Purple Gang, you know, East Harlem, especially Pleasant Avenue, was one of the kind of the epicenters of the heroin trade in the United States that was controlled by the mafia. There's a famous book, The Pleasant Avenue Connection, that's long out of print. You can find a copy for a few $100 if you're lucky. But it talks about the mafia in the late 60s, how they controlled Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem. And the Purple Gang kind of emerged after that Pleasant Avenue connection is busted up by law enforcement. but they continue on that trade, and they're heavily involved in dealing heroin, and as well as cocaine. And they kind of bridge that gap between when heroin starts moving out and cocaine starts moving in the late 70s. But these are guys that are directly involved with and reporting to and dealing with major figures in the Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno family. So yeah, the notion that the mafia were never involved in drugs is pure mythology.
Oh, absolutely. You know what, Thomas, they called him Fat Thomas, Thomas the Ambrosio told me, he says the difference between the coke dealers and the junk dealers, you know what it is? I says, no. He says, this week you're driving a Toyota, next week you're driving a Mercedes. In the junk business.
Yeah,
With
and
significant money.
yeah, absolutely. And it's always interesting. One of the questions I get asked, because I write about Florida a lot, is were the mafia ever heavily involved in the cocaine trade? And I got to say, that's one of the times I think they were outmaneuvered, because they were really very heavily involved in heroin. But when cocaine came on the scene, they were really kind of, especially down in Florida, kind of run around with the Colombians, and the Cubans really had the upper hand there, and really took over the cocaine trade.
Back
But
then, right? Was that the 80s?
yeah, late 70s, early 80s for
Yeah.
sure. But back in the 70s, the mafia were definitely knee deep in the heroin trade for
No,
sure.
absolutely. And that it comes up all the time. That's always a big question that comes up, and people talk about that a lot because of it was a rule, right? It was a rule that you couldn't deal in drugs. And a lot of people died actually for dealing in drugs, that, people paid with their lives for dealing in drugs, depending on what family you were from.
Yeah, but yeah, if you go back way back when, there was always that. And well, you probably know, anything to make money, I guess. If it's
Oh,
going to
yeah.
bring in a profit, you're going to do it.
Absolutely. And as we know, Paul Castellano literally lost his life for trying to enforce the no drug policy. That's
Yeah.
how that whole thing started.
Yeah, and during my research, I actually talked to the head of the district attorney, or I'm sorry, the U.S. attorney out of New York, who's head of organized crime now, prosecuting it. And one of the interesting things he told me was that of the traditional organized crime cases involving drugs now that he prosecutes, he primarily sees a big shift into prescription narcotics, things like oxycodone and those kind of drugs, where the mob has gotten involved in that aspect of it rather than the more traditional drug types.
Yeah, I mean that's a big problem today throughout the world, right? There's
Opioids, yeah,
and-
absolutely.
Yep. All right.
Cool. All right, good.
I think we're good.
Excellent.
I thank you for coming
No, thank
on.
you.
How can they find the book? Is it on Amazon? I know.
Yeah, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, then you have online or local booksellers will have it. You can go to scottdeitche.com and more about it as well.
Hope you enjoyed the story. If you would like to subscribe to this channel, you could do so down below. If you would like to subscribe to my other channel, Unlimited Substance Podcast, I'll add a link in the description for this video.